Turner, the protagonist from Last Night in Soho, is a system, and I'm going to explain it in this coming series. This series is going to contain massive and detailed spoilers for Last Night in Soho, and it's also a psychological thriller flick, so trigger warning for all above. For those of you unfamiliar who still want to go on, Last Night in Soho is a story that follows Eloise Turner, a young woman who can see ghosts and who goes on mysterious journeys to 60s Soho, London, every night when she falls asleep. The first 7 minutes of the movie introduce us really well to Miss Ellie Turner. Eloise Turner is a young woman living in the country with her grandmother, waiting eagerly for her acceptance letter to the College of Fashion in London. Our first indication that something is up with Miss Ellie is when she looks at a picture of her mom and then sees her mom in the mirror and talks to her. We do find out later that her mother took her own life when Ellie was 7 and that she was mentally unwell. When the acceptance letter arrives, Gran really cautions Ellie. She says the big London can be a lot, and that it was too much for her mother, and she didn't have your gift. When pressed, Grandma explains she didn't see things like you do. I don't want you to get overwhelmed again. In response, Ellie specifically says, besides, I haven't seen Mum in ages, which is a blatant lie. Before leaving for college, Ellie looks directly at the mirror and says goodbye to her mother, leaving her behind for the rest of the movie until the end. It's important to note that a lot of Ellie's identity is tied up in her mother and grandmother. She makes clothes because it's what her mom did. She wants to go to London because it's what her mom wanted for herself. And in chasing her mom's dreams, she discovers that her grandmother was all too right, and London is a very overwhelming place. But I'll go on in that in part 2. Stay tuned. Like and follow for part 2. I almost forgot that bit. This is part 2 of why Ellie from Last Night in Soho is a system. From here it gets pretty hairy, so on top of the spoiler warning, we have massive trigger warnings for above. So where we left off, we have young, aspiring fashion designer Eloise Turner heading into London for her first time to attend the College of Fashion. Her first night does not go well. First, her cab driver comes on to her, tries to proposition her, and she is very clearly made vastly uncomfortable by this, and reacts by refusing help from somebody else later too. And then we meet her roommate, Hurricane Jocasta. She is an awful person, and she is very much a bully. So despite Jocasta decidedly being a bully, in order to fit in, Ellie goes out with Jocasta and the other girls for a night on the town. And look at Ellie's face when she comes up in the back here and tell me that she's not dissociating. She doesn't want to be there. She's there because she has to be there in order to survive in this new world. Jocasta then proceeds to throw her under the bus when a sleazy man hits on her, and Eloise ditches out on the party early to go to bed. I repeat that Hurricane Jocasta is an awful person and a bully. Jocasta brings the party home with her, interrupting Eloise's sleep by hooking up in the same room that she's sleeping. And then the precious bean goes to sleep like this on her first night in London. This entire experience, from start to finish, Her first day in London was trauma after trauma after trauma. After no one waking her up and being late for her first class, Ellie decides, instead of staying to rent an apartment in Soho. Her first night in the apartment is when she has her first dream involving the character Sandy, which we think is an alter freshly split. But we'll cover that in part 3. Like and follow to keep up. This is part 3 of why Ellie from Last Night in Soho is a system. We're going to keep going, so remember, spoiler warning and trigger warning ahead. Where we last left off, Ellie had had a very first night in London. She ditches the dorms and gets a new apartment, and her first night, she has a very vivid dream where she's following someone named Sandy. And I'm going to show you the moment of switch in the dream. She sees herself as this other person in the mirror, twirls her hair. The person interacts. It's her, and she's in the mirror. We're going to get into Sandy's story later on, but that moment of switching is really spot on done for how some switches feel. So Ellie, from this point, starts to take on aspects of Sandy's identity. Her fashion project for her schooling, she's basing around the dress that she saw Sandy in. She changes her hair. There she is at the salon using one of the phrases that Sandy had said the night before in a dream. She even buys an almost perfect copy of the jacket that she saw in the dreams. If we remember in part 1, Ellie's identity, up until she moved to London, was very extremely informed by her mother and her grandmother. From this point in the movie, we start to see Ellie become all Sandy. She orders the drink that Sandy ordered. She buys the clothes. She changes her hair. She becomes this confident young thing taking on the big city like she saw in her dreams. But this alter formed from trauma, and it's not all sunshine and rainbows, as we'll find out in part 4 coming up soon. This is part 4 on why Ellie from Last Night in Soho is a system. For this video, we're going to go into the story of Sandy, who I believe is an alter split from the trauma of her first night. This video has some pretty intense trigger warnings for... So, Alexandra, or Sandy, is a young woman in the 60s in London trying to get a gig as a singer. She's introduced to a man named Jack. Jack is played by Matt Smith, and he does a fantastic job. In the beginning of her story, Jack is a very big influence, gets her auditions. You can see a lot of love bombing and things like that. As the story goes on, she winds up being put in a position. She is doing sex work for her alleged boyfriend, Jack. She very clearly does not want this. We'll talk about the effect that this story has on Ellie's life in the next video. Also, I'm going to show you some key points in the switching between them that really read DID to me. So Jack's banging at the door. Sandy doesn't want to. So Ellie does. And within moments, it's back to her. The guy hits on her and she's made uncomfortable. She doesn't want to be there. I'm with Jack. And everyone sees. So she said no. That one's important to me. She said no. Not I said no. She said no. There's a scene that's too long to show you where every time she's at the table with a different guy, she's giving a different name. Lexi, Sandy, Alex, Alexandra. Every time it's something different. This. Ever try to force because somebody needs you and they're just not listening? Follow for part 5. This is part 5 on why Ellie Turner from Last Night in Soho is a system. By now you know the drill. There's spoiler warnings and trigger warnings ahead. Last time we covered the story of Sandy, who I believe to be an alter split from the trauma of Eloise's first night in London. Where we left Ellie was that she was identifying very, very heavily with this young woman from her dreams as she sought success in a big city that was very overwhelming. As we remember, she redefined her identity, changing her hair, her clothes, and focused her fashion project around the identity of Sandy. It's also important that Ellie was neglecting healthy social contact with one of her classmates, John, who is a very... As her story starts to darken, as Sandy's story starts to get attractive, you start to see Ellie try and fail to avoid these dreams. So she's sitting in her room, and the record player seems to start on its own. And it's very clear that this is not something that Ellie has any sort of control over. So when the story progresses and gets worse and worse, Ellie starts to avoid sleeping. And this is a very bad idea in almost any case. It's at this point that we believe that Ellie is starting to have a psychotic break as she begins to have, she starts to see the men that had their way with Sandy in real life. Hallucinations are not a normal part of DID, but a psychotic break can happen to anyone under enough stress. From the outside, you can see her slowly dissolving in as she first isolates into this dream and then avoids it like the plague. And it's really poignant to be what a breakdown can look like if you're multiple. I probably have 1 or 2 videos left to talk about this, so keep on watching. This is part 6 of why Ellie Turner from Last Night in Soho is a system. This is the spoilers for the ending, so if you want to watch the movie without ending, stay away. So I'm just going to skim over the climax because remember this was a ghost story. So the climax is more about the spooky ghost story part of it and less about the psychological meaty bits. it winds up ending in the apartment she's staying in burning down and her winding up in the hospital. The movie then, time skips 3 months is our estimation. And in this time, despite definitely being hospitalized after the fire, she has completed her fashion project and done well enough to impress everybody. You can see here that her appearance is now a mix of where she was before and Sandy's look. Instead of just the brown hair, she has some highlights in it, and she kept the bangs and keeps styling it with that curl. So in this, you can see that Ellie is once again a lot more herself. And while we don't get to see a whole bunch of who that is, we definitely know that it's separate from who Sandy is. This is because in the last few moments of the video, we see Mom in the mirror. And that is clearly the first time that she's seen her mom since moving to London. Mom's out of dormancy. And then Sandy's in the mirror. And she seems surprised. But if you look, that's a smile. So, at the end of the movie, Eloise is the host of a system of 3, including herself, her mother, and Sandy. It's important to note that I don't believe that is what was intended by the writers. However, a lot of the details line up just way too well for me. There are definitely some details that call it out as supernatural, but for the fun of dissecting the psychological end of it, I really wanted to tell everybody what I saw in this movie, and hopefully other people can find it helpful too.